Today we continue on our sermon series, Life. So really, this is a play off of how many of you guys played the board game Life growing up? Or maybe you still do as an adult. It's just fine. It's a fun game to play. I think there's obviously some issues with it when it comes to, I think I shared a couple weeks ago when it comes to like collecting kids and then turning them in for money and other things like that. But it's still fun. So this month, we are going to be talking about life. So just a lot of general life questions, things that people wrestle with. Last week, we had a guest speaker, Isaac Archuleta, who is the interim director of Gay Christian Network. He talked about relationships. This week, we have a guest speaker who's a hospice chaplain, who's going to talk about death and dying, kind of an interview style. And next week, we have another guest speaker who's going to talk about her journey coming out to her family, growing up in a very conservative family. And then the week after that, we're going to talk about parenting, and we're going to have an interview panel with like 3 or 4 people who have raised kids, gone through that, asking them questions, and hopefully gaining information that's helpful for all of us in the midst of raising kids and the craziness that life throws at us in that. As we begin, I want to invite Steve Treblone, Treblone? Treglone. Oh, Treglone. Steve Treglone to come on up here. Steve, if you would go grab a microphone. I realized I don't know how to pronounce his last name, so I turned to him during the worship. How do you pronounce your last name? So I got the lone part right. But one more thing before we begin. I put out tissue papers on the inside of all of these aisles. I'm not anticipating that everybody here is going to cry. We're not planning on one of those services. But I would invite you to, if you're sitting on the inside aisles, to go ahead and grab those tissues, pass it on down the aisle. If you tend to be an emotional person like myself, maybe grab some. There's a couple of aisles in the back that don't have any tissues, so we're going to have to pass them back there. And I only do this because I went to Steve's house, I sat with him, and he shared some of his stories, and I got all teary-eyed and was like, oh my gosh. So I figured maybe it might happen to you, and I just figured we could do something with all that snot. So, yeah, you're welcome for that. I'm thinking out for you guys. And please make sure it gets back to the back couple aisles as well. So, today, as we begin, Steve, you are a hospice chaplain, but not everybody is familiar with what hospice is or what it means to be a hospice chaplain. So could you just give us a quick overview on what you do?
Sure. Firstly, good morning. My name's Steve. Hospice is a Medicare-funded thing. There are lots of hospices around, as you may or may not know. Hospice is for people who have two doctors who have signed a document to say that they have 6 months or less to live given the prognosis that they have, and that prognosis continues on the way they expect it to. So 6 months or less. So they're the people I deal with. Death for a lot of people is fearful. For me, it's kind of exciting. I kind of looking for it's kind of weird, isn't it? It's kind of exciting because the way I look at it, and I'll try to explain it to you. So 6 months or less, my job as a chaplain, when I go in, I'm a pastor, but I don't go in with my agenda. So it's not a matter of me going in there. It's not about evangelism. It's not about getting someone to say Jesus Christ is Lord before they pass. That's the agenda of some families, and sometimes I buy into that because that person wants to and the family does, but that's not my role. So my role is to go and provide support for the patient and for the family, to do the funerals, to do whatever it is, to support them in any way that I possibly can. I currently have Christian people, I have people that have been, and I would say 90% probably of all the people that I deal with have been in church at some stage but do not go anymore. And I find that really interesting. And there's reasons for that, but I won't go into that. So it's basically a support role Currently, I have a lady who is a Japanese Buddhist. So I deal with lots of different denominations, lots of different spiritual beliefs and understandings, and I'm there to support. I'm there to help those people traverse that time of looking to their own mortality and helping the families to cope with the loss and the grief that they're going to feel. Also, part of my role afterwards is to work with them for 13 months after that 12-month anniversary, and to be able to help them, with bereavement, with grief, and however I can. So that's partly my role.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And if you can't tell, he's got a little bit of an accent, so I'm a little jealous there.
I'm from down south.
Down under, which makes him easier to listen to, right? If anybody has an accent, you're like, yeah, great. And here I am, the boring American. That's my accent.
And you notice I brought notes today because I don't want to go off track, because I could talk for 4 hours at least.
And it would be interesting, because I sat there and listened to a few hours of it, and it was very interesting. So I wanted to talk about death a little bit. I don't think we do death very well in our society. We don't talk about it very often. We send people as they get older into these little communities, and then when they do die, there's usually a short little ceremony, and then it's kind of said and done. And I know a little bit from different cultures. My wife comes from a Filipino background, and I know there's a few Filipino people in our congregation too. And when her mom's mother passed away, they had was it about a week-long, 2-week-long ceremony in their basement with your grandma's body down there, which is interesting for some of us. We're like, whoa, that's weird. But inviting family and friends and grieving process and celebration and food and stories. And I'm like, at first I was like, that is so bizarre. Why would you want to be around a dead body? But the process of it, I was like, man, we do not do death very well here. It's very, very covered up. And I think a lot of times we have questions about what does it mean to die? And even as people of faith, what does that mean to die? And so I thought it would be interesting to have you. You have more experience than probably any of us, or maybe all of us in here combined, just because of your job, and you walk through that process with people. So what have you learned about death, and what do you think happens when people die?
Throw the notes.
We're jumping in the deep end now.
It is the deep end, isn't it? Let me explain how I think it all works first in my theology. And this is theology according to Steve, so you don't have to follow it if that's okay, if you don't want. The scriptures tell us that we are created in the image of God. We are created spiritually. When I first became a Christian, people told me, or I sort of got it from somewhere, that in fact what we are is physical beings, and we're trying through life to try and get some spirituality. We're trying to understand spirituality. What I've found as I've gone into hospice work is that that's not the case. The reverse is the case. That we are not, in fact, so much physical beings as we are spiritual beings having a physical existence. And I want you to understand that. It's very important. We are spiritual beings having a physical existence. We are inherently spiritual. And if you get that, then you can understand that death is just simply the death of the body. We don't die. And I say that often at the funerals and celebrations of life that I do. We don't die. Just simply the body dies and the spirit moves on. So if you can get that concept from where I start, then one of the things that I see happen, and I've seen a lot of people die with me holding their hand in front of me, I think death is a beautiful thing. And I know it's weird for me to think that, but the more I experience it, the more beautiful I think it is, because I see the wonderful things that are occurring in it. I sat down with a man, and he was sleeping a lot, and I said to him, "Do you dream?" And he said, "Yeah, I dream a bit, but generally I just sit here." And I said, "Well, what do you do?" He said, "I think about my life." And I said, "So, what do you dream about? What do you think about when you're thinking about your life?" And he said, it's funny you should ask me that. He said, I was just thinking this morning before you came that there was a conversation that I had with a man about 35 years ago. He said, and as I reviewed it in my mind and I could see the look on his face, it suddenly occurred to me that I hurt him when I said what I did. 35 years later, God is doing life review with this man as he's entering that stage toward death. And God is helping that man learn how to do his life better. That's how intricate it is. We serve an awesome God. We seriously do. And God is there for each one of us. As you pass, God is going to be there for you. It's not a matter of judgment. Don't get that. It's not a matter of judgment at all. This man didn't feel judged because he judged himself. He realised what he'd done. But God made it very acute so that he could understand exactly what he did wrong and to understand that. I want to share with you some stories because the stories are probably the best ones. The man's name was Bill, and Bill was on the other side of Phoenix here, and I turned up to see him after I'd looked at the chart and realised that Bill was doing dialysis, and from what I understood, he was going to stop dialysis and his kidneys weren't functioning at all. So I turned up and I introduced myself. He firstly told me that he had no family and that he had nobody there. The first thing he wanted from me was, he said, I want you to be with me when I die. And I said, look, I will do my very, very best, but I can't guarantee that because I don't know when you're going to die. But I'll do my best. So then I said to him, I want you to understand exactly what you're doing. I said, by stopping dialysis and your kidneys not functioning, within probably 7 to 10 days, the toxins will build up in your body and you will pass, you'll die. I said, are you okay with that? And he said, yes. So I said, fine, I can work with that. The second thing I did was tell him some of these stories. And I said, Bill, what's going to happen is that as you get closer to your time of passing, you're going to see people from the other side. People who are dead, but they're not dead at all. All that's died is their bodies. He reached out and he grabbed my hand and he said, Steve, I'm already seeing them. And I said, tell me about it. Sometimes they can tell you, sometimes they can't, but you know that they're seeing it. And he said, at the end of my bed here, I can see shapes of people. They're blurry, but I know that they are people. And I said, okay. And then he went on and said, last night a lady came and sat with me all night. And he pointed to the side of the bed, and I knew this wasn't a physical person because it was about 6 inches between the bed and the wall. So I thought, okay, there's obviously some spiritual things happening here. He looked at me then and he said, the woman was black. And I looked at him, and I've got a bit of a tan, he didn't. He was as white. And I looked at him and I said, why on earth would a black lady come and visit you all night? He said, I've got no idea. I didn't either. I didn't have an answer to that one. We talked on for another 20 minutes or so, and all of a sudden he stopped, and I could see that aha look on his face, and I knew something was up, and I said, what's up? And he said, I can remember my grandma died before I was born. I saw a picture of her when I was about 5 years old. He said, my grandma was black. Who was it that came to visit him? His grandma. Who was it that came to nurture him? You women don't stop nurturing, you know that. Even after the grave, you don't stop nurturing. She came back and she was with him all night. He said she never said a word. She was just there all night to provide support. How beautiful. I told Bill 7 to 10 days. It's strange because on the 9th day, I went back to visit him again after I'd done a few times during the week. and I could see that he was getting close. And I said, Bill, I don't know about that promise that I made to you, because I think you're going to pass tonight while I'm here, and I really can't stay all night. So I said my goodbyes. Next morning I woke up and looked at the triage report, and guess what? Bill was still with us. So I quickly jumped in the car, zipped across Phoenix and turned up, and when I walked in, as I walked in the door, I could see he had about 5 minutes left. How gracious is God? God allowed him to stay alive long enough for that wish that he had for someone to be with him when he passed. Otherwise, he would have passed alone. I went into the room. I grabbed his hand and I said, Bill, it's Steve. And he half looked up, shook his head. He knew it was me. I read him a scripture. I prayed with him, and moments afterwards, he took his last breath. How absolutely beautiful. He did it his way. What a wonderful, wonderful thing. Lots of people have Alzheimer's. I went to see a lady, and she was in the last days of life, and you know what Alzheimer's is like. They lose everything. And this lady was speaking what we call word salad. So she was speaking, I don't know, they're not even words, I'm not sure what it was. It was sounds and letters. And she was contracted on the bed. The arms and the legs were all contracted. She had bed sores fairly badly. And it was time for her to move on. So this was my first visit, my initial visit. So I turned up to the bedside, and I just grabbed her hand and held her hand and tried to get her attention. As I got her eye contact with me, I just started saying things, because I realised she was a Christian lady, and so I started talking spiritual things with her. And this is the amazing thing. For 20 minutes, that lady clicked out of what she was in and spoke with me like you and I would speak. For 20 minutes. It was unbelievable. She would ask questions and I would give her the answers. And they were spiritual questions. She wanted to know things. I believe what happened is a miracle, that God opened her up because there was something she needed before she passed. And I was in the right place at the right time. I'm no miracle worker. God's the miracle worker. But I was there in the right place at the right time. As soon as I finished and prayed with her, she went back to that nonsensical speech that she was in. And on the way out, I said to the social worker who was coming in, I said, give me a call after you finish. And so she went in, and after she'd finished, she gave me the call. And I said, how did you find her? And she said, nonsensical speech. She wasn't there for her. She was there for me because I had something that she needed. How absolutely beautiful. And that is the way God works. We know that scripture, come unto me, all ye labour and heavy laden, I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me. What Jesus is saying in that verse is that when we are in need, we can reach out and ask Jesus to come and yoke with us and go through it with us. And he will. Whether it be suffering, whether it be death and dying. And Jesus will go through it with us. How absolutely beautiful. We don't do it alone. We never do it alone. Because we are spirit beings, we are always connected to our Heavenly Father. Wow. You want some more stories, or we run out of time?
Sure, we can do another story. I love story time, so.
Which one will I tell you? There's so many. There's so many stories. Sometimes people use metaphors for things that are going on in their life. When that end of life is coming. For instance, one lady said to me, I need to catch a bus, meaning I need to move on. Maybe in her life she caught lots of buses, I don't know. And she said, buses keep coming, but they're not the right one. One day she said to me, "My bus is coming." And very soon afterwards, she moved on. Interesting, isn't it? It's interesting how it all works. There are so many. This man had Alzheimer's, and he had lots of problems inside as well. And when I explained to this man about the things that I'm talking to you about, he reached up to God, he looked up and he said, "If you're going to do it, hurry up and get on with it." And you could sense that real frustration in him. And just how God mellowed him. I tried to explain to him, about learning things before we pass. And one of the things he had to learn was patience, which brings me to another story. I visited a 101-year-old lady. I'll try and pull the mic away when I do this because I'll use the voice that she used. And this is some of the concept that people get in their brain. She said to me, and I'll use the voice, she said, "Why won't God take me? Aren't I good enough?" And she was 101. And she was wondering why God hadn't taken her yet because she wasn't good enough. And I said to her, it's not about good enough. It's about learning the lessons that you've come to this life to learn. I'll take the mic away. She said, "What lessons have I got to learn?" And I was a little bit cheeky with her, and I said, "I think patience might be one of them." She took it in good humour, and about 3 days, I think it was about 3 days, it was a week, it might have been a week later, she moved on. But she got it. She got the idea that it was what it was all about. It's about learning. It's about doing those things that God wants us to do to complete our life, to find peace, to find harmony, to find what we need to fulfill our lives and make us complete before we move on. How beautiful.
Yes. I want to just take a moment, and if you have the tissue box, wherever it is, can you pass it back down through the aisle just in case anybody needs some more? And no pressure, you don't have to cry, it's okay. But I just want to be aware of that as well. Death, how many of you guys have lost someone very close to you? Okay, most people in here.
2 hands up.
2 hands. So Steve, as a hospice chaplain, you've walked alongside of many people dying and seen families and just different dynamics and what people need. What advice would you give to those of us here who are watching as we walk alongside of somebody dying, of what to do or not to do?
Firstly, remember that a dying person hears until the very last breath. The last sense to go is hearing. Just remember that. I've seen families arguing over the deathbed about who's getting what. And I said to them, "You realise that she can hear everything you're saying, don't you?" And the looks on their faces was quite drawn back. So yes, be careful with that. One of the most beautiful things that I do, and probably it's one of the most precious things I do that doesn't come out of my mouth, hold someone's hand. Be truly present with the person. I won't go into it, but I've got a lady at the moment, and I go and I hold her hand, and I just look into her eyes, and what she doesn't realise is that I'm channeling energy at the same time as I'm doing this, but I hold her hand, and she just looks at me, and she's so thankful. And the other day she said to me, "Thank you for taking the time to care." All I was doing was holding her hand as far as she was understanding. But take the time to care, to truly be there. One of the things I find too, and the advice I would give you, is if you've got a relative who is passing, or even a relative who's not passing, and you have unforgiveness issues, sort them out now. Don't wait. I had a man who said, I have a son, and you'd think that now I'm dying that he would come and see me. And so I thought that was a bit strange, and I said, "So how long since you've seen this son? And he said, 30 years. And I said, if you haven't found him to be important in your life in the last 30 years, then he's not going to find you important in his life between now and when you die. And it didn't happen. And he died a broken man because it didn't happen. His son just didn't come. He wrote him letters and he did not reply. So if there's anything that you've got relationship-wise, sort those things out now for goodness sake, because they are important. They are things that make people suffer at the end of life because they don't die because they're hanging on. And there are reasons why people hang on, because of unfinished business. So if you've got unfinished business in your life, finish it, because it's going to make you suffer at the end of life. Don't fear death, yours or anyone else's. Yes, we're going to feel the loss. You've loved deeply and you're going to grieve deeply. That is life. You wouldn't have it any other way, would you? Would you love less so that you didn't grieve as much later? Of course you would. It doesn't make sense. So you are going to hurt. You are going to feel that grief. But you don't have to suffer. If you're caring for loved ones, don't ever promise them you'll never put them in a home. Please don't ever do that. Because sometimes you get to the stage where it just has to happen. You just can't do it. Find time for yourself. Find some me time if you're caring for somebody. Don't just keep giving and giving and giving and giving, because if you collapse, the whole thing collapses. So find time to look after yourself. And don't feel guilty. If you can't be there, please don't feel guilty. Guilt, what does guilt do? It doesn't sort anything out. It just hinders you. So don't feel guilty about what you put in and what you don't put in, and don't feel guilty about having me time, because me time is absolutely essential. You can ask me more questions? All right.
Yep.
I won't go into the next section.
Locked and loaded. You did not bring one of your little booklets up, did you?
I did not.
Hey, Chapin, would you be able to run outside really quick right by the greeting hall? There's that little table has some of those little booklets. If you can bring them in and bring them on up to me. So what advice would you give to those going through the grieving process themselves? If they've lost someone, they're already passed, what advice would you give to them?
I would say go easy on yourself. Don't feel, thank you. Again, don't feel guilty about things that have happened in life, things that maybe you didn't sort out and didn't realise at the time. Grief is not the enemy. Death is not the enemy. One of the interesting things, and I've spoken with Julie about this, many things in life that we fear, we need to lean into. The Christian world is the opposite to our world. If something causes you pain, then you generally need to lean into it. And if you lean into it, grief comes into our lives for a purpose. It comes to change us. We should welcome that change. And that sounds weird, doesn't it? It sounds weird that I think death is exciting. But if you lean into grief, then grief does the work it needs to do in you. It changes you, and then you come out the other side. And how beautiful that is. I'm not saying that you're not going to feel the suffering of the loss. There's no doubt about that. We do feel the loss. But we don't... Yeah, it's hard to explain it all. I won't try. One of the interesting things about grief is that everybody grieves differently. Some people, and I've seen it at the bedside, where families are picking on each other because one person is crying, one person is not, one person is thinking about lunch, trying to organise the practicalities, the Mary and Martha thing, You know, people are grieving in different ways. Some people will not grieve right there, but they will grieve later. You know, some people will go and sadly take out their addictions and grieve that way. Everybody grieves differently. So don't think that just because somebody's not crying or not dealing with it the way you are, that they're not grieving, because they are. They are feeling that loss incredibly inside, and they're just trying to deal with it in the best way they can. And yeah. Okay, that's probably... Yeah, grief will change you, and that's probably the basic of what I would say there. Grief will change you, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing. I think grief helps us to be more compassionate with others. It helps us to be more present with them. It helps us to love and to experience people in a very different way. And we start, you know, how many times have you been to a funeral and you come away and you're thinking about mortality of your own self? And you think, you know, that... And I say that to people sometimes. That, you know, it depends where I am. But, you know, we have this little box where the ashes are in. And I say, who would have ever thought that we could have put David in a box? But here he is in a box. But he's not in the box, is he? Because this is just the vehicle that he travelled through this life with. This is not him. He's here somewhere. That's another story I could tell you about that. I'll talk about it afterwards if you want. This little book that we've got here, I've made a little book about my experiences. And these are the people that have actually told me. So I know many people go through these, well, I believe personally everybody goes through what I wrote in this book. But sometimes you don't see it. Sometimes you do see it, but they can't tell you. These are the experiences of people that I've seen experiencing it, and I've asked them, what are you seeing? One of the interesting things that I find, and I'm still exploring this, is that when we pass, the people that come to meet us can be a conglomerate of people, they can be lots of family, or they can be some of the spiritual figures that we expect to see. So, for instance, a man passed the other day, and he was a very devoted Catholic. When he looked up in his last moments into the right-hand corner of the room, which is where mostly they see these things, who do you think he saw? The Virgin Mary, of course, because he was Catholic. Why is it that Protestant people don't see the Virgin Mary? I'm still exploring all this. Sometimes people see Jesus himself. Sometimes they see their mother. Sometimes they see a whole lot of others. I could tell you so many stories. There's so many stories in the book. I wonder whether my little Japanese Buddhist lady, before she passes, is going to see Buddha. It makes sense, doesn't it? That God, because there is only one, and there may be many ways of getting back or many ways of understanding, that God meets us where we're at. One of the beautiful things that I can remember have we got time for this? Yep.
Sure.
I can remember my first memory in my whole life was when I was 3 years old. My mother took me to a little preschool. It was a little Catholic preschool. She dumped me and ran. I remember looking in there around and seeing this strange building, these weird people, and seeing my mother exit, and I went, wah! I was not happy. This, my first memory of life was not a good one. Maybe I need some counselling on that, I don't know. What I find with people who are moving from this life to the next is that God doesn't yank us from this life to the next. And I'm not sure about accidents and things like that where people die instantaneously, but when the normal progression of life happens, God doesn't yank us from this life to the next and we turn up in heaven and we look around and we go, uh-oh, I don't know anybody here, I feel awkward, I want to get out of here. It's not like that at all. My experience is that as we progress, God starts introducing the other side to us. one of the interesting things that I find is that people who have no faith in anything are very distressed at the end of life. It's almost as if the other side is being presented to them and they realise that they're going on a journey, but they're not prepared. They've not packed a case. And they get what we understand as terminal restlessness. They get agitated. And sometimes even the medications will not fix it. People are agitated. My experience is that people who have faith die a very gentle death. That God introduces the other side to them, and then they simply move on.
Wow. By the way, how many of these did you bring?
There's enough there for at least one each.
Okay, so he brought those, and these are just stories of his experiences, which you can pick up on the way out if you're interested. Obviously, there's plenty for everyone to have at least one.
And if you know anybody who could do with a book, take 2 or 3.
Please.
Sure. It's a ministry. Give them out to people. Share them. The only comment I've ever had back on this book was it's not long enough. That's not true. Another lady said to me, I said, have you read the book? And she said, I read half of it. And I said, why half? She said, I couldn't stop crying. It's a beautiful book. And it will touch you like the stories and like they did for you. These stories touch you on the innermost tender part, because that's what God is dealing with us. You know, if the book brings tears, let it be so, because God is dealing with that part of us that is so soft and tender, which is the part of Him. One more thing before I stop. No, I've lost my thought. No, lost it.
I have another question, but first,
sure.
If I may jump in and make one comment, and you can tell me how accurate this is. I don't have near as much experience, but from what I've learned from other people walking through death and grieving process, is the best thing you can do, and you kind of hit on this when you said reach and hold their hand, is to be there. Just to be there. And that is the simplest but the most difficult thing to do with somebody, because it's uncomfortable. When they're uncomfortable. And their grieving process is a process, and it's waves, and it's up and down. And none of us really likes to be in the pain, right? And so when we spend time with somebody else, we kind of get sucked in there, and we're living that with them. And so what I have seen from some people as they shared is that people pull away and they lose friendships and relationships. So if you have somebody that's walking through that now or in the future, maybe just make a commitment in a calendar and something. Like, I will call them on a regular basis. I will take them out for coffee and just be there. And just know I don't have to have answers. I don't have to solve whatever's going on. I can be there in the midst of the high or the low or whatever it is and be present. Would you agree with?
Absolutely. Listening. You know, if you're going through somebody who is grieving, then listen. They will talk and talk and talk, and they will tell you the same story about how they died over and over and over again until you're bored stiff. But they need to do that. They need to talk the story, because each time they do it, they push it out there and they see it for what it is, and they try and transform it again and try and get a different understanding about what happened. So let them do it. You don't need to give them comfort. Hold their hand, hug them, whatever, but you don't have to say anything. And please don't tell them you understand, because you don't. Yeah, you have no idea, because it's different for each one of us. Yeah.
Any last thoughts or advice on?
I wish I had that thought I had a moment ago.
It'll come back after.
There are so many beautiful things about the job that I do. Just so many experiences that I've had, and so much growth that it's caused in me, for me to understand the heart of God. And I think that's what I've understood through all of this. You know, each time I go through a death and a dying with patients, and then organise with the family and do things, you know, just that heart of God, that the way God has orchestrated it all and is there for us. He is always there for us. and how beautiful it is, and not to think that at the end of life we're going to do it alone, because we never do. God is there with us. He transitions us from this life to the next.
You have another thought? Go for it.
The thought I had before came back.
All right.
About where's heaven? And this is an interesting thought. If I say to you, where's heaven? Most of you will point upwards, right? But I come from Australia. We're on the other side of the globe, facing the other direction. So in Australia, when we point that way, in relative to you, we point that way. We're still pointing up, but we're pointing to a different up. Interesting. From what I understand, our Milky Way is a flat disk, tilted a little bit, but it's a flat disk. So when you look up into the stars here, you see a certain amount of stars. In Australia, when we look into the stars, we see some of the same stars, but we see different stars. Why is that? Because the Milky Way, as God has made it, America is looking into outer space. So there are probably less stars in the sky that you can see because they're further away. In Australia, we see more stars because we're looking into space. We're looking into the centre of the universe. Think about that. So when we point up for heaven, what does that really mean? It doesn't mean anything, does it? I'll end with the theology of Steve. I wonder whether heaven, in fact, is not out there, but heaven is here. I wonder whether we just flip from one dimension to the next, that our loved ones do not go very far from us at all, that in fact our loved ones are still here. Which brings me to stories about how people, after their loved one has passed, they can have conversations with them, how some people even see them in some respect. I could tell you so many stories.
Can you thank Steve for coming up and sharing with us? And Steve, I think, will be here afterwards, out there maybe by the table with these. Again, you can get these books, but if you have any other questions to talk to somebody who's walked through death and dying with lots of different people, if you have questions, he'll be here. He's a great resource to have. I'm going to set these right down over here. I'm going to invite the worship team to come back up here now. In just a bit, we're going to go into communion, but I wanted to say a couple of things. In many churches, you would find the pastor getting up and saying, this is what the Bible says about death and dying. And to be honest, the Bible says a lot of things, and people interpret it very differently. And some people, heaven is streets paved with gold, and for others, there's a literal burning hell, and people argue over a lot of these things. Here, I thought it would be nice to have somebody come and share with experience. So it's a more experiential approach. This is what I've seen from my perspective walking through death with other people. And I loved how open you were. And I wonder if this is what it means. I wonder if heaven is more here. I wonder if we switch, if we transition here. And I love that approach, and I really appreciate that. And I think if I look at the Bible, one thing that I think we can gather is have an enormous amount of hope. For whatever it is that comes after. And I love what you said, fearing death, just leaning into whatever we fear. And so today, first, gosh, where do I want to go? I'm going to skip that quote, and I'm going to just read a portion in the Gospel of John as we transition into communion. In John 12, verses 20, the author begins, "Now among those who went up to worship at the festival were some Greeks. They came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and said to him, 'Sir, we wish to see Jesus.' Philip went and told Andrew. Then Andrew and Philip went and told Jesus. Jesus answered them, 'The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Very truly I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. but if it dies, it bears much fruit. Those who love their life lose it, and those who hate their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. And I think I have a slide on there, Jen, for just a little quote, the passage of the grain that falls and it dies. So there's lots there that you can unpack theologically and what this means. For this little seed to be buried in the ground in order for it to be broken up, in order for life to come out from it. And some of the things that you share that kind of echo this is a quote from Richard Rohr, where he says, "We cannot experience rebirth or being born again without experiencing some real form of death first." And so the way I understand it, the spiritual path, the path of Jesus, is a path of death and resurrection. And some people might say it's all a preparation for the death, which is another preparation for something else. And so how we live this life matters, because it's a series of small deaths. And so today, perhaps you're here and you need to be reminded that life is just more than you. That life is about breaking yourself open and pouring yourself out for others. Perhaps you're here and you're exhausted from breaking yourself open and pouring yourself out. And maybe you need to be reminded that it's okay to say no, that you are limited in things, and that if you're constantly breaking yourself open and pouring yourself out without the reciprocation of being poured into, you cannot live that way forever, right? And so at the core is almost this paradox. There's a time to break yourself open and pour yourself out, and there's a time to be poured into. So today, one of those questions is for you to wrestle with. What in my life am I breaking myself out and breaking myself open and pouring myself out? And how am I allowing myself to be poured back into?